A&E returns to Kennedy's Don't Cry.
We know it will not be easy to campaign against a man who has spoken and voted on every side of every issue. Mr. Nixon may feel that it's his turn now, after the New Deal and the Fair Deal. But before he deals, someone's going to cut the cards. That someone may be the millions of Americans who voted for President Eisenhower, but would balk at electing his successor.
We've traveled within and outside of the United States over 500,000 miles, mostly by air, but a great deal by automobile, some by even ox cart, by boat, and virtually every type of transportation. There have been over 3,000 speeches made in campaigns and all over the world. As far as number of countries, we now have visited, since becoming, holding the present office, 55 countries over the world. We met a lot of interesting people, some very, very important people. In fact, in running down the types of people we met, we found 35 presidents and 15 prime ministers, 2 emperors, 6 kings, of course a number of queens, 3 or 4 sultans, and so on, up and down the line.
We should rebuild our military strength, not because we want to declare war, but because we want to declare peace. If there is any lesson of the summit, it is that the communists believe that the military balance of power is shifting in their direction. Why was it necessary for a presidential candidate in Brazil, in the middle of his campaign, to pay a visit to Castro? Why was the United States unable to get an indictment of Castro by name at the last meeting of the Organization of American States? Because the power and prestige of the United States, relative to that of the communist world, has diminished in the last decade. Because these people wonder whether the future belongs to the Castros and the Khrushchevs and the neutralists who are turning to hostility. They wonder whether the future belongs to freedom. Now that is the great issue of 1956. Can you imagine if this country elects a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate and elects Dick Nixon, Republican President of the United States, and then Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn go over to meet with him as the leader of the Congress and sit down with Dick Nixon, who in 1952 said Adlai Stevenson had a degree from the Cowardly College of Containment, in 1954 called Truman a traitor, in 1960 called me a liar, in 1960 called Lyndon an ignoramus. Lyndon says he called me one. No, I say he called Lyndon one. He called me rash, improved, reckless, naive, and uninformed, but he called Lyndon an ignoramus. You think he's going to go down and work with him? I don't care how many rescue squads they send to help Dick Nixon travel around the United States. I don't care if Cabot Lodge and Nelson Rockefeller and Barry Goldwater all prop him up and push him forward, and I don't care if they add Dewey, Landon, and Hoover to advise them how to win.
The people of the United States in this last week have finally caught up with the promises that have been made by our opponents. They realize that it's a modern medicine man show, a Pied Piper from Boston, and they're not going to go down that road.
for the presidency of the United States because it is the center of action. I run against a candidate who reminds me of the symbol of his party, the circus elephant, his head full of ivory, a long memory and no vision, and you have seen elephants being led around the circus ring. They grab the tail of the elephant in front of them. That was all right in 1952 and 1956, but there's no tail to grab this year. It's Mr. Nixon himself, and I don't believe he will secure an endorsement of the majority of citizens of this country at the time of day.
Jack Kennedy was elected President of the United States in 1960. The victory margin was slim, less than 120,000 of 68 million votes cast. Johnson had been an inspired choice. Mayor Daley and his political machine a blessing. Minorities had been instrumental in the victory, but it was going to prove difficult to meet their expectations. In the realm of foreign policy, Jack Kennedy spoke boldly.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Under Kennedy, government became a family affair. Brother Bobby was appointed Attorney General, and that caused eyebrow lifting. But then Teddy, just turned 30, announced himself a candidate for Jack's Senate seat. The older brothers were embarrassed, but their father backed Teddy's decision. And then there was Sergeant Shriver, a son-in-law.
First time in 2 years, when the phone rang, was the president on there, and he called a couple of times, and finally my wife said, "Sarge, you've got to talk to Jack now. Remember, he's the president." And so I said, well, all right, I will. So about the third time I got on the phone, he said, listen, you've got to come down here to Washington to run the Peace Corps. I said, well, Mr. President, you know, I don't know anything about any Peace Corps. And he said, well, that's all right, neither does anybody else. And I said, but yes, but remember all the political debts you incurred during the campaign. Why don't you give this job to one of your political friends? He said, listen, Sarge, the truth of the matter is that everybody thinks the Peace Corps is going to be one of the greatest fiascos in history. It turns out that way. It's much easier to fire a relative than a political friend.
First, I want you to meet the lady who started it all. I feel that parents should be responsible for their children, so we really can blame our first guest for the way hers have turned out. May I introduce to you the head of the most successful employment agency in America, Mr. Joseph. The story of a typical American family from Hyannisport, a small town in Massachusetts. And the next seems like carrying coals to Newcastle because she is our secret weapon, our universal ambassadress, whom the people of France affectionately call Madame la Présidente, Jacqueline Kennedy.
The credit Rose Kennedy was accepting belonged in large part to her husband, who no longer attended public functions. At 71, his son in the White House almost a year, Joe Kennedy suffered a crippling stroke. His capacity to speak had been impaired, but he could still think clearly. He spent his time keeping track of his successful sons, even helped Teddy when he ran in '62.
Kennedy's Don't Cry will continue in a moment.